SCLD and YU would like to acknowledge many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories where York University campuses are located, which precede the establishment of York University. Our podcast is produced and recorded on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Hey Lions! Welcome to Student Conversations, Stories, and Lessons, where we explore the journeys of students navigating through the complexities of leadership, personal, and professional growth. We are your hosts, Sakina and
Jannat Jacoby.
And this series is all about diving deep into the real stories behind the student experience. Stories that inspire, challenge, and empower us to grow. In each episode, we will sit down with students from diverse backgrounds to discuss the challenges they have faced, the lessons they have learned, and how they have become the leaders they are today.
So whether you are just starting in your academic journey, in the midst of it, or looking ahead to what is next, this podcast is your space to gain insights, find inspiration, and connect with the shared experiences of others. So, without further ado, welcome to our episode where we will be exploring emotional intelligence.
Hafiz, pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, of course.
Just to do a little intro on you, Hafiz, so that our listeners get a little idea of who you are and your role on campus. You have a work-study position with the Vice Provost of Students as a social media ambassador. You are studying your last year in education and very active within student life, especially involved in clubs like Soccer World and York Black Students Association. So, Hafiz, what brings you here today?
I heard we had a conversation about emotional intelligence, and I have to be here. I love talking about it. It's something that I've had to grow and learn over, and obviously there's still a long way for me to go, but I feel like I've learned a lot in my personal life to the point now I'm comfortable enough sharing what I learned.
Yeah. And for anyone that knows Hafiz, I mean, firstly, there's not a time that you wouldn't see him skateboarding around campus. If you see anyone skateboarding, it's most likely Hafiz. Yeah. But for anyone that knows him,
or I stole his board and I'm riding around campus. That too.
He's a very calm, collect, and grounded person. So he's definitely a great person to talk about emotional intelligence.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
I remember when we were going through our list of podcast topics that we wanted to cover, and we were like, Hafiz is such a good option. Our only option for this podcast. Candidate. Because we genuinely feel that you embody emotional intelligence very well, and we look forward to having this very fruitful conversation with you, exploring emotional intelligence and what that entails, the different components of emotional intelligence. And honestly, just to get right into it, I know Jannat wanted to just share a little bit about this book.
Yeah, and even prior to the recording, Hafiz and I, we were talking about when we were doing our reading into emotional intelligence and, gaining more knowledge in that, because I feel like it's one of those things where it comes up in a lot of conversations, but I really wanted to sit down and, listen and properly learn about this beyond, from sort of when you can just pick things out of your own brain and sort of wing it. So, and this is not by any way endorsed. None of us are getting any royalty money from this, But there is this book called Emotional Intelligence by Dr. Daniel Goleman. If you search him up, he's a really renowned journalist and psychiatrist in the US, and he's actually one of those people that have pioneered study and research in emotional intelligence. And I know, Hafiz, you were looking into his work as well and his videos, so there are a few things that we will be talking about from this book and from what we've picked up from the videos and interviews we've seen from him.
When I was doing a bit more research, because understanding the concept of emotional intelligence is something that acting on the idea of emotional intelligence is something anyone could do, but not necessarily know how to explain it and how to describe it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the people who I know, who I look at them and I'm like, damn, you're pretty emotionally intelligent, right? A lot of them, if I was to ask them to explain it, it gets a little hard. It's one of those things that's like, you know it,
it's
but
like intuitive almost.
Yeah. So I was struggling to define it, because when I asked myself, I was like, okay, what is this? I really struggled to define it. And so I had to, I wanted to do more research and kind of see if there's like a specific definition. And funny enough, one of the first things he mentioned was that there is no specific definition of it. And so I think that opened my eyes to understand that, wait, we're not really defining a word, we're describing the characteristics of it. And that allowed me to kind of further expand on, well, firstly, how he defined it, but also like a simple way of describing emotional intelligence. What he used, he divided it into 4 different domains. And so he said the first one was self-awareness. So this is understanding your own emotions and the impact that it has on you. And then he also mentioned self-management, which is, okay, so now you know your emotions, but can you manage your emotions? And specifically in the tricky situations, because obviously when it's like an average day, an average scenario, for most people it's not very difficult, but when it really gets challenging, can you manage it? And then social awareness, and this is where, you know, being empathetic to others, to the people around you, really understanding about other people's feelings, how to react to them, how to support them, so on and so forth. This is the part, the social awareness part, extremely important. And then relationship management as well. So when conflicts occur, how do you handle those situations? When you need to build rapport with someone, how do you do those? These are the 4 domains or pillars that he has used specifically, and I think they're a wonderful place to start in terms of understanding.
Shout out to Dr. Goleman.
Thank you for, providing that insight and just an overall overview of what emotional intelligence entails. Really, we look at it and, it's like you said, it's not a straightforward definition. It's definitely a concept in itself. And just delving into that, I think we can navigate some of our conversation into touching on those 4 components that you touched on, and just, also navigating how we can develop those and how we can suggest to our listeners, especially students within the university, on how they can take, small steps to help them strengthen each of these components, including, self-awareness and so on and so forth. Jannat, you want to come in?
Yeah, no, the point that you mentioned about being able to develop emotional intelligence is a very important point, because comparing it to your intelligence and IQ versus EQ, so the emotional intelligence, emotional quotient, versus the IQ, that's the intelligence quotient, right? The intelligence quotient.
Yes.
I was like, intelligent or intelligence? So intelligence quotient, it's very different. And that's what I really appreciated from Dr. Goleman's work, is that he's like, you can develop emotional intelligence. It's not like you cannot learn it or you're born without emotions, because I feel like that's a big concept that's really perpetuated. And compared to IQ, where it's like there are some that are gifted and a little bit more advantageous, but it's something that everyone can definitely learn and develop within their life if they choose to do so.
Yeah, I actually think it's something everyone needs to develop and learn.
Oh yeah,
there's a certain correlation between someone who has a higher EQ as opposed to someone who has a higher IQ over EQ, is that the person who has a higher EQ often is more successful and does better in life in general. And that's because the way life works is we have to interact with others, and how we interact with others is extremely, extremely important.
I think one point I want to touch on that is, because as we navigate through our emotions, obviously there's going to be ones that come in as hurdles for us, or that we really have to learn to be able to navigate through and not let take over us. And I think just in having that courage to do so, and having, again, entailing, this is all defining what emotional intelligence is. But when you have that sense of awareness that, okay, I'm going through these emotions, but you're watching your emotions rather than becoming them, right? So, you know, like if you're having anger, right? Instead of being angry, like you feel like I am angry, I am the emotion angry. No, instead, if we look at it as you're watching, okay, this is something I'm experiencing, not what I am. And I think that's one way that we do develop emotional intelligence. And I just wanted to, it made me think of that, the point that you just brought up. And
yeah, no, I think that's an extremely important aspect of it. I guess to dive a little deeper into it, two important things that are going to be necessary is one, self-reflection. What does that mean? Well, the ability to actively listen and take in input from others, but also to react to the input that you're given. Because if you just listen to what people say and don't do anything about it, literally nothing's going to change.
Right.
And it's really hard, and I think this is where a lot of people just give up on it or feel it's not necessary. It's hard to hear criticism of yourself, right? Like, it's really we all want to think we're an amazing people, and most people are, but like there's still we still have a lot that we could learn about, that we could work on. And I think just the listening skills, the active listening skills are so critical in terms of
no, like active listening, that's the biggest thing when it comes down to differentiating between those who are like narcissists, because those people don't listen to others. It's like always about me. But active listening is like you are engaging with the person, you're making eye contact, you're like, you know, there was open-minded. And you know, it was interesting because there's like one way to determine if someone is actively listening to you is if they bring up something you talked about earlier in the conversation or previous conversations before. It's like a really good, you know, variable to test that out. And especially like when you're connecting it to leadership overall, and like Hafiz, you can, you know, jump in on this, is that we know when someone within the workplace is actively listening or is embodying those like emotionally intelligent components. You know, it's like what makes a boss versus a leader.
Yeah, and I think it's so prominent in the work environment where I'm so glad you used those two words, where some people are actually a boss and others are a leader. Well, they're both those. Like the leaders are also a boss, but like in a different way, right? I think the biggest and most important difference is to make sure that the others feel heard. And I think this is where active listening actually falls into it. But it's not just them being heard, but also acting on it. Now, if someone's requesting something unrealistic, right? There's a set procedure. There's a set procedure as to how to make sure that they're acknowledged and they understand that you are willing to, if you are able to, take action on it, right? First thing is not be dismissive, right? As soon as they're telling you something, you're like, okay, that's a valid point, you know, okay, I understand. I might not relate to it.
Or you don't have to agree, but it's like open-mindedness, 100%.
Yeah. So you don't have to, it doesn't have to relate to you. In fact, more often than not, it does not relate to you. Because if it does, you probably would have tried to do something about it, right? And so, but understanding that, hey, this is a different person who is telling me something they're genuinely dealing with, right? And it's like, okay, first I listened, like I understood that there's a problem, I acknowledged that there's a problem, and then I take that information, I'm like, okay, well, is there anything I could do right now to help? And if the answer is yes, then they actually do it. Actual leaders will do it. If the answer is no, then it's like, okay, well, are there other alternatives that I could do to somewhat support what we want to support? If the answer is a flat out no, because at times leaders are constrained by, you know, their bosses above them per se, then just explaining the situation to them where it's like, I understand what you're going through. If I could, I would do this, and this. And as long as you're able to explain a vision to people, they're more than happy to
like
just
act on it themselves.
Yes, but also like if you could explain how you want to go about something and you're not able to do it, at least they will see that, hey, this person is actually trying. They want to help me, but it's out of their order. And I think that's like a big differentiating factor between someone who's a leader versus someone who's who's just a boss. A boss would be like, yo, do this. A leader would be like, all right, let's do this together. Or let me show you how you could do this. And I think it makes a big difference there.
Yeah. No, definitely the process comes in and how a leader navigates challenge and, any barriers that might come their way, especially with a team. And I think that was a very good point to touch on. I'm just transitioning a little bit into the general benefits that we develop from emotional intelligence. Off the bat, what's something that comes to mind when I ask, one of the benefits from that?
Honestly, my favorite one is just building what feels like unlimited connections. Because it's you have the ability to connect with others at a very personal level, in the sense that they will feel like you genuinely care about them, and that's a huge thing. For me, that would be one of the biggest ones. It's like you develop real relationships with people, and it's limitless, because if you are somebody who is able to empathize with others, is able to express how you feel, to show off your true self, that breeds authenticity, and everyone loves being around authentic people. And so I think that's a very, very big one. But also, I think for you personally, you find that you're more in control of yourself, and I think that's something that's very hard to do, especially in like challenging situations and stuff. But once you manage that, once you know how to be in control of yourself, once you understand who you are and how you're able to be in control of yourself, you're unbeatable.
That's such a good point, because I was literally thinking about this yesterday, where it came to mind that I'm in control of my brain. Like sometimes I literally have to sit there and be like, I choose what to do. Like if my brain doesn't control me, I control my brain. And when you tell yourself that, you really are able to embody that as well. And that's so true, that you just, you are able to control your life more when you have this emotional intelligence, because you're so self-aware of your own feelings, your own thoughts, and of other people. And it allows you to even navigate through situations more successfully, I'd say. Definitely. And just like you were touching on, Jannat, that it's more, you're more successful when you have higher emotional intelligence. Yeah.
And continuing on that trail of, being more aware of what you're doing. I think also for me, one benefit from, I don't know, and it's so interesting because Hafiz, you mentioned before that like people who have emotionally intelligent characteristics, like they're not aware of it. This is something I think all of us, we had to like actively think about, because it's not something I think about. But now that I'm putting into words, I think another really great benefit is I know the why behind of what I'm doing things. And I think this is something we can all relate to, us having that like religious and more spiritual background. Why is a very important thing. And I don't know what it is. I feel like it really unlocks like a different level of existing within this earth.
I think it's purpose. That's literally the word, purpose.
Having the purpose and having the meaning and have like, I don't know if you guys ever, like when you guys were kids, like when you would look into a mirror for too long, you're like, that's me. Like I'm doing things. Like, I don't know. I had those moments. I'm like, that's me.
And still like, you're like, I did that.
Yeah. And like having like the little narrator in your voice all the time, and like the commentary, and like this little like omnipotent being in your head, like constantly analyzing everything you do.
Yeah.
But I feel like, and I had this conversation with someone, I forgot if it was like a professor or it was my mom or something. It's always one of those two people that I'm having conversations with. But it's, even though there is like this weight, and sometimes it can feel like a burden carrying all that weight of self-awareness, at the end of the day, when I'm, those quiet moments, like right when I'm about to go to sleep, like I feel this contentment before I go to sleep.
Because you just know things about yourself, right?
Yeah.
No,
And
I
it's
know what
like,
you mean.
I'm not just like floating into, like, I'm not floating around. And like, I read the statistic where like only 20% of the population is like self-aware. So most people out there, they're just like floaters and kind of going through the like movements. And that's why like I see this like indifference with the way people treat each other nowadays. There's like this lack of compassion and empathy.
Yeah. That's a very valid point. And I actually want to add one more thing to that, and I think that's probably more important than anything else we mentioned. It's the fact that more than anything, it gives us a reset method, a method to reset when we fall down. Because if you end up in a situation where it's like, okay, I've fallen down, but I'm not looping. I'm not entering a loop of of
like regression.
What's the right terminology here? It's like usually when you fall down, if there's no structure in place, you'll struggle to get back up. But with being emotionally intelligent, you already have a structure in your life.
Like bounce back rate?
Yes.
Able to bounce back.
It skyrockets the ability to do it. At that point, you understand what you need to do to be successful. You understand why, usually you understand why you're feeling that way, or you know how to identify or how to go through the process of identifying why you feel that way. And it's this system that kind of just takes care of itself.
The one thing I noticed in what you said was you might not know exactly what to do, but you have so much self-awareness that you can navigate through that challenging time.
I think that's another important point where it's like certain people feel like they know everything about themselves. And I think you've work to do in terms of
on that point, like everybody's changing all the time, right? So that's the thing, we have this never-ending discovery of the self.
But some people believe that like that's it, I know everything I need to know about myself. And I think if someone does, like if you genuinely think you know everything there is to know about yourself, well, A, you're wrong, and B,
or you're going to be stuck. Like if you convince yourself that that's all you have about yourself, then you will not be opening new doors for yourself, right?
And evolving continually happens. Like you're going to grow, you're going to change, your perspective is going to change, your surroundings are going to change, everything is going to change, and you're going to have to adjust to it. Part of like a critical aspect of being emotionally intelligent is understanding that when different situations change, my perspective of what I consider or what's considered emotional intelligent will also change, because in different environments, emotional intelligence looks differently. And I think that's also really important to
I think in this, in this whole discussion, we did go over a little bit about some strategies folks could use to become more self-aware, but just to explicitly state some, right? What's some strategies that we can suggest to the folks listening in?
I think a big one is taking time to yourself where there's 100%. No distractions and
100%.
all you're doing is reflecting, just reflecting. You need that moment, preferably in nature, but you need that moment where you clear your mind so that you don't have other thoughts getting in the way, so that you don't have other thoughts clouding your judgment, because that happens so often where it's like, okay, the pressure of this is changing how I act in a certain way, or pressure I'm putting on myself, right? There's just so many different things, but just being in nature and just being able to reflect is extremely important.
Like one thing that I find very fruitful and meaning is prayer. That's one thing for sure. It could look like different things, different people, like meditation for a lot of people, but also journaling. Growing up, there wasn't like a mindfulness when it came down to journaling. When I was like a kid, I was always like, dear diary, this is what happened in school. But you know what, if anything, maybe not to like undermine that, like writing down those like the day-to-day little dramas.
Significant.
They were significant because I was like accepting that, this is how I perceived others. This is how I felt about it. And then now that, especially being an adult, getting into university and like learning more about like the world of journaling, there's a lot of like, I think the concept is called shadow journaling, where it's like this process of
finding the things that you maybe are hidden, like that you don't know about yourself yet until you write it down.
Like it's like that path of healing. And
it's honestly like I feel like journaling can be a process that brings you to become a lot more self-aware and a lot more like even socially aware, right? Because like you said, you're writing down the experiences you've had, you're writing down things you experienced in the day, and in just doing that you're again reflecting, like you said, Hafiz. And I think they all tie in together, and I think those were two really good points to bring up together because they definitely like touch on each other. I know with journaling, and now like Jannat, you've had me reflecting on that and how that's actually very much contributed to my own self-awareness and overall my emotional intelligence. I feel like in my own personal journey of life, I've been able to strengthen my emotional intelligence a lot in my university years. And I think that really came from spending time with myself, but not in a way where like I'm afraid to spend time with myself, where I'm like, I'm forced to, or like I have to be alone and I have to go like on a walk. Like I had to get rid of all those pressures to be able to do it so peacefully and like have zero expectations on myself. It was more so just, hey, let me go on a walk because I became self-aware that was important, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That was something.
Like I was my stress or something was coming up. I need to take a breather.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And I was actually going to mention my little advice would be to take a deep breath.
Oh, yeah.
That's so important.
Mindfulness.
I think one of the coolest things I learned when I was trying to learn a lot about, the human body, how we relate to ourselves, was the fact that you cannot be anxious and taking deep breaths at the same time, because they both cannot happen simultaneously. Like, it's just not possible.
You have to would you say you have to mentally let go of the anxiousness and then you don't let go of the
you don't have to mentally. So even while you're anxious, all you have to do is make yourself take those deep breaths.
Yeah.
There's the concept called box breathing, where you inhale for a certain amount, you hold for that same amount, and you exhale for that same amount.
That stuff works.
Like 777, right? I think that's what it is.
There's
like
different numbers.
Yeah.
There's 4 I heard
4,
that works
7,
really
3,
well.
something
I heard
like that,
7.
yeah.
I heard 8 as well.
Yeah.
And depending on what you get it, I heard 12 too. Some people are.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's
But
a different
I would
level.
recommend the 4 to start off with.
Yeah.
And if you do that multiple times, you will automatically find yourself calming down, because they both cannot happen simultaneously.
And that in itself, when I mentioned, take a deep breath, I really meant like the process of deep breathing allows you to let go of those anxious thoughts and let go of those anxious feelings and just things that hold us back ultimately from understanding ourselves better or understanding the things around us better, which is literally like the process that would be the opposite of developing emotional intelligence, right? If all your emotions are clouding your judgment, then the way to get rid of that is to really like you take that deep breath, and it's going to take a lot more than one probably, but just honing into that presence of the self is going to let you become self-aware.
And I think a really, really important part to add is you will not be able to do that unless you're in a safe environment. So make sure you're in a safe environment where you could actually let loose. And I think once you get to that environment, you'll be able to proceed to
or even creating that environment for yourself.
I was going to say that, definitely creating it, like if sometimes I think it really starts with first you want to feel like it's a safe environment. Like you might start doing box breathing in your room because you're like a little maybe self-conscious about it. I remember I did that because I was like, well, this is a weird breathing process that I feel like no one else I have been exposed to has done. So I remember I would like box breathe in my room. And then at one point now, like you guys can see during the podcast, I'll just be like, like in the middle, like there's other episodes where I'm just doing that. And I feel like I can pull that out now where I've created that space for myself to be comfortable enough. But it brings us back to like the idea of that we've always mentioned in our other podcasts, which is just you have to take that first step, which is take that first step for yourself in terms of, making yourself feel an extent of comfortability to be able to do it where you are. And then that just builds up over time.
Yeah. And I think that's like, that kind of goes back to a benefit of emotional intelligence is that you can be your most authentic self. And also with getting to know yourself further, everyone, there's no one way of living that's like, here's a blueprint of living that like everyone, because everyone has different personalities. Everyone has different views of life and, the way they deal with stress, the way they deal with happiness and all those sort of things. So when you have that self-awareness, when you know more about yourself, you're able to like live life much more enjoyably because you know that, oh, this is what works best for me. Because, even though and for me, breathing does work. That's another thing that I try to do I'm trying to do more often. And,
mindfulness breathing.
And mindful breathing, exactly. And, the fact that you're, doing it between those pauses of the podcast. And, this is not a practice that, everyone does, or some people may feel that it doesn't work for them, but it works for you, and your way of life has enhanced, and I like to use the word like unlocked, like you've unlocked a different level of consciousness because you know yourself better.
In terms of knowing yourself better, I think that comes from really difficult conversations, just having the ability, the courage to have those difficult conversations is also what allows you to develop this emotional intelligence.
Yeah, it is tricky handling situations like that
Yeah.
but unfortunately, the whole purpose of emotional intelligence is understanding how to navigate those situations. Because easy conversations are easy for anybody to navigate, but when it comes to difficult conversations, how do you navigate them? The only, and I repeat, only way you're able to do that is by jumping into it head first and going through it. That way you'll understand what
with
sort
a
of
deep breath,
are.
if I may ask. Because if you
Deep breath would be
don't,
great.
I was just like
Mindful breaths.
Mindful, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, but it's 100% thimportant. You have to be able to go through difficult situations. The one advice I have is the more you could create those difficult situations in a safe environment, the more quickly you'll be able to develop emotional intelligence. Because, I mean, God forbid you might end up in a situation where you're dealing with an unsafe environment that requires emotional intelligence, and that's where you learn it, in a very unsafe environment that has, negative consequences. But if you're able to do it in a much safer environment and build those skills at that point, I think that's a huge win.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us
Thank
today,
you so much,
Hafiz.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.
What a fruitful conversation.
Fruitful, veggieful, like.
Candy cane full.
I don't know.
We are tired, everyone. Please get some rest this day, this
Deep
weekend.
breaths and
I'm
naps.
sure. Definitely be taking care of yourselves and, get the rest you need and develop some emotional intelligence. Yeah. It's going to help you definitely through the academic year. So.
Oh, yeah.
Every aspect of your life is going to help.
Every aspect, in and outside of this university campus. So thank you for listening, and thank you, Hafiz, again for joining us. Stay tuned for our next episode.
See you then.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay,